What is a valve spring height micrometer, and why do you need one? Well, we've got those answers and more. I'm Tim Johnson. You're watching Shop Tool Reviews. Today on Shop Tool Reviews, we're going to learn how to use a valve spring height micrometer, why we need to use one. We're also going to lap some valves using a common cordless tool, and then we're going to do something you may not have seen before, and that's kind of redress the top of the valve stem so that the rocker arm contact is using a perfect surface, if you will, after you put your heads back together. We'll also have some other tips in here, explain some of the geometry that's going on when we have a valve train. Let's get started. This is the valve spring height micrometer tool from Comp Cams, and this comes in very handy when you're setting up your heads, setting up your valve train, and when you want to make sure that you're not going to have any issues when installing your new cam, new valve springs, new valve train altogether. So we're going to mock up this cylinder head so that we can use this tool so that we can find out what our max height is of both the actual valve stem or the valve altogether, as well as this spring is going to be, because we need to know that depending on, how much lift we can have before we have coil bind, whether we need to shim these at all. And I'll draw out a diagram here in a moment to kind of show you why we need to do this. But first, before we do it, let's talk about a couple of things here. To use this, we have to actually install the valve in each one of these locations, and we need to have it as it's going to be in the engine. Now, we're not going to install the valve spring. Obviously, this is going to replace the valve spring. So your height micrometer tool is going to replace the valve spring in this scenario. So we won't be installing the actual valve spring. However, we will install all the other components that go with that valve spring, and so on, just without the valve spring. So we'll install the spring seat, if you will, or the seat cup. So on aluminum heads, we can't use, obviously they're not cast iron. If we had the spring right against aluminum, it would just eat into that aluminum over time with 300 pounds of seat pressure. That's just going to eat into it very quickly. So there's a couple of different types of cups or spring seats. There's one like this that's pretty much like a stock LS style seat cup or valve spring cup, if you will, valve spring seat. This like this, where you have the seal that's molded in to the seat itself. Now, there's some that have different colors for intake and exhaust. This is a set from, I believe, Brian Tooley Racing from BTR. They're all the same color. They're all blue, so we don't have to worry about whether we're putting them on intake or exhaust. Now, Comp Cams actually like this better. They have a two-piece design where they actually have a hardened spring seat or spring cup, if you will, that actually goes down and sits over the valve guide, and then it just sits there, and then you add the seal later and push it on top of there. Now, why I like this design is because it allows me to install that cup and do the testing like we're doing here without doing my final assembly, which I would have to do if I installed this seal here, because these are made to press on once, then to get them off you're using channel locks or a special tool, and I just don't want to do that. I don't want to pull this owner off. I also want to do a final cleaning after I'm done here, so I don't want grimy grit and that sorts of things getting on my valve seal. That's very important. We want a good seal on our valves, and I really only want those valves going through there once if possible. So I like the Comp Cams design, which is like this. However, you can't always use, different people's products with others. In fact, I recommend highly, if you buy a set of valve springs, that you buy all the components from the same, because as you can see here, here's a set of Brian Tooley Racing Beehive springs. Here's a Comp Cams spring cup, if you will, and it will not work with that spring. However, again, just for showing you, I'm going to use that so I don't have to install the valve seals. And what I will do is I will actually take measurements in the thickness of this cup versus that one and subtract that, because all I'm wanting to see is, do we have any variation between number 2 cylinder and number 8 cylinder, from the furthest closest valve to the furthest valve, if there's any variation. That's what I'm checking here. I know my max height should be absolutely fine. Again, I can double check that. So let's get started here. But before even digging into that, the first thing we need to do is actually lap our valves. And we'll go ahead and show you an easy way to do that that works rather quickly. Let me stand this up. So we can see here, this is our number 2 cylinder, this is our number 4 cylinder. And if you look, we've got a real shiny valve seat here. And that tells us that's obviously been used. That's typically what it looks like after it's been used. I don't really have a lot of pitting, a lot of problem areas. I can see a little bit of pitting in here, not really anything other than it's where I can see that it's not that shiny. And then on the intake side, it's nice and clean. I can see the contact patch. Now, there's a couple of ways to do this. We could actually, install these. Let me grab number 2 here. And we can install these valves, put them in there, put some valve grinding compound on them, use our little cup tool here and make like we're actually making a fire and spin these things and try to lap these valves. Well, if we look at these exhaust valves here, the exhausts are always nice and dirty on these. And I say dirty, they basically get a hard scale from a lot of the heat, and we really need to dress that up, and that can be time consuming when doing that by hand. So there's an easier way to do this. And what we want to do is to ensure, even though that we may have numbered our valves to make sure they came out of the same location, we still want to marry this valve to that seat. Well, what I'm going to do first, I'm going to make sure this is nice and clean, so take some brake clean to it, make sure it's absolutely spotless, don't have any trash on there. And then I'm going to just take a little bit of clean motor oil and just put me a little strip down it. That's so it goes through my valve guide without any issue. And before I do that, I'm going to take my valve grinding compound. I'm just going to put a little around the edge. It really doesn't take much, but I'll go ahead and put some all the way around it. And carefully put it through my valve guide and spin my valve as it's going in. Okay, and as this comes in, obviously we're going to use that valve grinding compound to marry those two surfaces together so we get a perfect seal, or at least a near perfect seal. Now, when we get done here, we should see a contact patch here where we've got this shininess. It should be nice and gray. It should be visible to the eye. Now, you can add some dye chem, which is like a blue dye or red dye, depending on what color you get, and it will show you different imperfections and things as you're doing this. All of these are in nice shape, so I really don't need to do that, and we'll be able to see this by eye, and I'll show you here in a moment. So now we've got our valve sitting in here. Let me turn this head around. And again, rather than from that side, let me spin this back around here. Rather than from this side and taking our little cup tool and put it on here to actually spin it, we're going to turn it around this way. And I've just got an old bolt that I've cut off, and I've got it shoved into a little piece of a vacuum hose, some hose that actually fits on that valve stem. And then I'm going to take a little cordless drill, chuck that up in there. And so now, as you see, I have no hose clamp or anything else. If you've got a big piece of vacuum line, you may need to put a hose clamp on one side or the other. I like to use something that's tight on its own so that I don't have to take this on and off, because I've got to do this 8 times. So if I had to take a hose clamp loose, that'd be kind of a pain. So anyway, so let me turn this a little sideways, and so we can see my valve. I'm shoving it in and out there, and I've got my valve grinding compound on there. Well, I'm going to take this in low speed. I'm not going to crank it as fast as it'll go. I'm going to take a little bit of oil on my fingertip here, a little bit of oil on my fingertip, so that it will spin on that valve. I'm going to hold the valve into my fingertip. Rather than pulling with the drill, I can hold the pressure here and hold light pressure against it. And you will hear it be very coarse initially, and then it will fade away and get very smooth, and you'll feel it as well. And so I'll bring the valve back out and back in, and kind of resituating that compound on that seat. Okay, I know this is not done yet, but I'm going to pull it out just to show you. Pull this out. And so it's starting to dress up that valve, but I've still got a lot of spottiness there. So it's definitely not perfect, but it is definitely getting there. Okay, same way, my valve seat is starting to darken up, but I've got some shiny areas still there. Still got plenty of shiny areas in there, so I need to make sure I dress that up to where it's all a nice dull gray finish, and we'll see the same on this seat here, and you'll also hear it and feel it as you're doing this. So more compound. Now after a little longer, you see now we've got a nice dull gray contact patch all the way around this. So I'm not worried about up here. Obviously that's not a contact patch. I'm not worried down here. This is just where it actually seats in the actual seat. So clean this out. And same thing here. Now we've got a nice dull gray finish all the way around. No pitting, no issues there. And so now that valve is done. And what I'll do is I will actually go ahead and mark this number 2. And now I know that's number 2 valve. Obviously that's exhaust. That's not going to be hard to mistake. And now I'll go ahead and finish these others as well. We can time lapse that, but maybe you can see it as I go again. By the way, the intake valves should be a little less annoying to you. Typically they're a lot cleaner, especially on an LS. Some of your direct injection stuff, that is not the case. And as I mentioned, the intakes are just usually a lot easier on a non-direct injected engine. Sometimes you have a lot of gook on a direct injected engine on the intakes, but not so on these LS. They seem to stay a lot cleaner, and that one's ready to go already. So it doesn't take near as much time on marrying those seats. Okay, so we've got our valves lapped in. Our head is done. So our head and our valves are lapped together, the valve seats and the valves. So we're good there. However, there's one component of the valve that we haven't addressed yet. Now, if these are brand new valves, you don't have to worry about this part. Or if you took it to your machinist, they may have taken care of it as well. But we need to dress the top of these valve stems or reface them so that they're nice and flat, because over time, especially if the valve hasn't turned or got stuck in a certain area, it may have worn a groove in here, which may be damaged altogether. But most of the time, you'll find that there's just little bitty imperfections there that we can dress out of there. Now, many people will tell you, take this to the machinist and have it done, and that's not a bad idea whatsoever. However, if you're wanting to just kind of put your heads together on the bench and take care of this yourself, it is possible. We're not building a NASCAR motor here, but to each his own. You may be building your own, drag motor or circle track motor or just something for your street car. This can be done, and it's not hard to do, and it works. It's worked many times. Anyway, so to do this, let me try to find a valve here. And by the way, if our audio sounded horrible before, we found out that one of our plugs were unplugged. So rather than reshooting everything, we're just going to ask for apologies. Now we should be plugged in and good to go now. Anyway, so we can see here on this valve stem that it is very shiny, almost like chrome. We'll try to get a close-up here, but this is almost like chrome. And we'll show you that there's probably more imperfections there than what it looks like. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to make sure I have a very flat surface that's very, very clean. So I've got this stainless top here that should be just fine. Now there are various ways you can do this. I am going to take some paper for a DA sander. This is 400 grit. And this has got sticky on it, so it'll work out quite nice. Probably not going to stick too well, but I don't need it to. I just need it to stay in place and be flat. Now, I've got a piece of hardwood. Now, you could use pine if you wanted to, but the hardwood should hold up a little bit better. And I've gone to my drill index and found a drill that's identical to the valve stem size. So now I think you can figure out what I'm going to do here. I'm actually going to use this to keep that valve perpendicular. So to dress up that face, I'm going to stick the valve in there like this. So now we have that part sticking out. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to hold down firm on the valve a little bit harder than I hold on the wood, but I'm still going to hold down on the wood as well to keep us nice and perpendicular. And I'm just going to, obviously I'd go faster than this, but I just want to show you. I'm going to pull the valve out here, and you'll start seeing some low spots show up on this valve face here. And I want to try to turn this valve as I'm sanding, but I'm going to stop and just pull it in one direction and not rotate it. But I'd recommend you spin it as you're doing it. And again, we're starting to see a low spot form right in the dead center. It almost looks like kind of an oval on this one. I'm going to keep going here. Just kind of move it around, keep pressure. Now we're starting to see that diminish. We've still got a shiny spot right in the middle. Almost gone now. Yeah, so now it's gone. However, what we have now is we've got these lateral marks from sanding, and we really don't want that, because what happens, if you don't know this, so as the rocker pushes down on this valve, it doesn't hit it in the dead center, and that's on purpose. Usually you'll see the geometry of the rocker is off to one side or the other, and that's because when it pushes down, it's got that rocker effect. When it pushes down like that, it will actually spin that valve if it's off axis, if it's off the center, so that it never touches it in the same place again. So over time, this valve is spinning in there as it's going up and down. So I don't want those lateral marks on there. And I'm just going to clean off my sandpaper, push this down, hold it in one space, hold it in one place, and just spin that valve. And you can feel it, and you can hear it. And now we get that nice circular pattern, just like it's been machined on there. Now you can argue with me and say that that's a terrible way to do that. I'm just telling you, it's worked on countless times. I know plenty of people who do this. So is the right method to take it to the machinist? Absolutely. They can put it on their valve grinding machine and they can reface this. They can cut you new seats on the valves themselves. But that, in a situation where you're rebuilding a head, maybe even replacing a valve or a valve spring, will absolutely get you by with no problem whatsoever. And then the last thing I want to do, there may be a sharp edge here. So I'll take a piece of sandpaper, preferably a piece of old sandpaper, and just kind of dress that sharp edge. I don't want to hit the shaft here, but I'm just making sure that there's no lip there that's going to catch my valve seal as we install it. So I'm going to feel for no sharp edges. Now we're good to go. So our valves have been lapped. This one has not. This was from the other side. But as you can see, I'll pull one of these out. And the valves have been lapped. I've got a nice dull gray finish there. And they've been refaced and got a nice circular pattern here on the stem. Now we're ready to mock this up. All right, well, our valves are lapped. We're ready to actually use the Spring Height Micrometer tool to check our max spring height. I've got this awesome set of headstands here. Made these out of some rebar, some heater hose, a little bit of angle iron. Works just great. Anyway, let's go ahead and set these up. Okay, we want to make sure everything's clean. So we want to make sure that our valve guides are nice and clean, have been blown out, there's no debris in there. We want to make sure that our valves are clean. And let's go ahead and grab our number 2. Now we know that this is our exhaust valve because here's our intake and the runner goes this way to that valve. So this is our intake here. This will be our exhaust. Again, make sure everything is nice and clean. To again use a little bit of oil here and carefully install these up there. Make sure that your spring cup or your spring seat is in there, and then we'll use the micrometer tool in place of the valve spring. But then we need the retainer and even the keepers or locks or whatever you want to call those. I call them keepers. It's just what I've always known. So now we're in there, but obviously we're loose. The valve's loose in there. So now what I'm going to do is, obviously this thing spins. It's knurled on the top and bottom. This one's kind of tough to read here, so I'm going to get you in a different angle. Okay, so we'll see as I spin this up, we'll see some marks under here. There's the marks under there. You can see the marks starting to show. And you just want gentle pressure on there once it comes up. There we go. So we'll pressure on the locks to make sure the valve's seated all the way in there. Make sure it's sitting on your cup, your valve spring seat. And then I can read that marking. So this is 1.5 inches, and then obviously it starts at 0.6, 0.7, and then I'm at 60. We'll call that 67 because there's 60, there's 70, there's 65. So I will call that 67. So that's 1.767. So 1 inch, 767 thousandths. All right, to do this whole head, it only took me about 8 minutes once I just turned the camera on and started doing it. So this is not a long, tedious process to double check to make sure we're going to be within spec. Now, you can see here's all my numbers. So number 2 cylinder, number 4 cylinder, 6, and 8. And my largest number was 1.772. My smallest was 1.752. Now, the smallest number is the one you want to go by if we do have to do any shimming. Now, here's the critical thing. If you're within 20 thousandths, again, different companies may spec different things, but typically a good rule of thumb, if you're within 20 thousandths across all of these, then you're good to go anyway. We're exactly 20 thousandths from our largest or smallest to largest. So we're definitely where we don't have to run any shims whatsoever. However, if we did want to run shims, we would use different thicknesses shims to shim up each one of these to get us within spec of being within that variance here. So this is pretty critical if you're outside of that window to make sure that all our rocker arm geometry and all our valves are going to be opening at about the same amount. And just to double check my math, your math, so we have 1, that's your whole number, and then we have the first number, let's use our smaller, the 7, that'll be our tenths, okay? And then our second number, the 5, that's going to be our hundredths. And then our third number is our 2, and that's our thousandths, or thou. So if I said 20 thousandths, that would be a number 2 here and 20 there. So 5 plus 2 is 7. Bring down the 2. So 0.772 would be 20 thousandths greater than this. Now, why is all this even critical? Well, let's take a frontwards view of the engine, and we've got a camshaft. Now, we're talking about a typical overhead valve engine, not an overhead cam engine. So we have one cam that will drive push rods, then we have a rocker arm that this push rod pushes up against, and then we have a fulcrum, and so then this rocker arm pushes down on the valve. So we have valves that are a certain length. We have push rods that are a certain length. We have lobes on our camshaft. And the same camshaft that is pushing this rocker here is also on a V8 pushing a rocker over here, which is not so critical in what we're talking about today. But now let's take a look at this longitudinally. I think that's the right word. Anyway, so then we have the camshaft here. And then we have the rockers up here. And we have the push rods. So what we're measuring is this height here to make sure that if we're not kind of coplanar here, so if we had kind of this going on, something was up with the head or actually the cuts in the valve spring seats, I've seen that be a problem before, or we had major wear in one of the valve seats. So that can all cause this, and we may have different variations in these heights, which is going to affect the rocker arm ratio or rocker arm fulcrum, as well as could actually interfere with the amount of lift that we'll get at the valve as well. So that's why it's very important that we keep these coplanar, or we keep these an equal distance apart from the actual center camshaft, which is a bore all the way through the block, and the fulcrum of all those rocker arms and the tips of the actual valve. So those rocker arms are contacting all those valves at the same moment, at the same angle. Okay, I hope that helped you a little bit, maybe explain some things to you. Maybe you didn't learn anything, and I'm sorry for that. Obviously, you know more than I do. It's not hard to do. Anyway, when it comes to valve trains, camshafts, rocker arms, valves, valve springs, there are different ideas, different theories. There are even different tools that people swear by when setting these up. Number one, you got to be careful. Number two, just use common sense a lot of times of keeping things very clean and very lubricated, especially when you're going back into the assembly phase. Now, I have some, preferred methods of doing things, as well as, preferred companies that I like to use as well. I mentioned that I definitely like the two-piece spring seat as well as the valve seal, so it's not all in one unit, so I can take those on and off as many times as I want to before actually installing the valve seal. But again, different parts from different manufacturers are going to work absolutely fine. Just be careful when setting this up. I also mentioned that as long as we're within a window, in this case 20 thousandths, we were absolutely fine with that height actually differing from cylinder to cylinder or valve to valve. Now, if we were off more than 20 thousandths, we would have to buy a shim kit and shim up those taller ones or more space to shim down to get to that minimum clearance or within that 20 thousandths of that minimum clearance. So be careful when you're putting things back together. Hopefully that helped you. If you've got any questions or you hate the way we did it, let us know in the comments. Also, if you wouldn't mind, would you hit that like and subscribe button if you haven't done so already? Always follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And by all means, if you hated our video, then give us a thumbs down. But as I mentioned, would you let us know in the comments why? Have a great day. Keep smiling.